And with that, I turn the time over to Senator MIke Lee.
Good morning. Thanks for that nice welcome. I'm definitely not in Washington. It's always a beautiful time to be in Utah, and today is no exception. And I'm reminded of why it is everyone loves Davis County. People in Davis County are really nice. And I want to start out my remarks today just by telling you how grateful I am for the opportunity that you've given me to represent you in the U.S. Senate. It's a privilege, and it's an honor. It's also a solemn obligation, one that I take very seriously, and one that I work really hard in trying to do right. We've just come off of some interesting episodes in Washington. It's been an unusual time, an historic event. We finished the impeachment process recently, as some of you may have heard about from time to time on TV. I never dreamed that I'd be part of such a process. It was interesting. It was a little unusual in the Senate. When you go into the Senate every morning during an impeachment trial, the Sergeant-at-Arms opens the meeting by issuing an announcement that's been in place for at least 150 years during impeachment trials. They say, basically, don't talk, and if you talk, you'll be imprisoned. And we don't usually hear that. When you say that to a room full of politicians of any stripe, including and especially U.S. senators, they get sort of a panicky look on their face. We all were taking bets on who would be the first one, both on the Democratic side and on the Republican side, to be arrested for talking. We were pretty sure it was going to be Lindsey Graham. And Lindsey, rather than pushing back on it, to his credit, just owned it. He said, "Oh yeah, totally, I will make it 5 minutes." But nobody got in trouble for that. But people responded in their own way to deal with the monotony of the thing. A number of my colleagues, I won't identify who right now, you can read about it if you do a search. A number of my colleagues just fell asleep periodically. I didn't do that. I actually found the whole thing very interesting. I wanted to make sure I didn't fall asleep, so I responded to it by taking notes. I took a lot of notes. I went in there with a book, one of those big bound journal type books. Ended up taking 190 pages of notes. And so I wanted to make sure that I stayed on top of who had argued what. It was helpful to me, even though I knew there was going to be a transcript produced at the end of each day and at the end of the process. I wanted to be able to refer back to my own notes, even within the same day, so that I could remember who had argued what. As I neared the end of the process, I discovered that I didn't have very much room left, so the last couple of days my handwriting got really small. I was using a small mechanical pencil. I'll have to go back and see if I can still read that next week with the unaided human eye. Some of my colleagues responded differently would doodle, would draw pictures of things. I was sitting in between Rand Paul from Kentucky, who sits to my right, and Lamar Alexander from Tennessee, who sits to my left. Looked over one day and Rand was drawing a picture of the Capitol. I realized Rand's a good artist. He's good with his hand, he's an eye surgeon. And then I looked over and I saw he had written some notes of a different sort. He had written on a piece of paper, I kid you not, "Help, I've been kidnapped, these are not my real parents." And then he handed out so the reporters up above could see us. Who does that? And it made me wonder, in Rand's hypothetical humorous world, was I his mom or his dad? Or I don't understand. It was funny.
Is it over yet, Senator?
It's over. It's over. The process is over, and at the end of it, I was left with an unmistakable conclusion that I will defend to my dying day, which is that there was nothing charged or proven that was even remotely impeachable, and so I voted to acquit the President of the United States. As a former federal prosecutor myself, I looked at the charges. The charges themselves failed to allege anything that is itself even impeachable. Now, and I say this as someone who was criticized extensively by members of my own party a few years ago. Someone suggested we impeach President Obama. And I said, look, I disagree with a whole bunch of stuff he's done. I read the Constitution very differently than he does. I think he has pushed the contours, pushed the edges of his authority too far in many instances, but I don't regard it as impeachable. To impeach or remove a president of the United States who's been duly elected by the people of the United States, you've got to have a pretty significant reason to do that. You don't do that for light or transient reasons. So I took some heat at the time for pushing back on people who said we should impeach and remove Barack Obama. I likewise pushed back against these folks who brought forward charges that themselves failed to allege an impeachable offense, and charges that were themselves not backed up by evidence. In that circumstance, I had no choice but to vote to acquit because he didn't do anything impeachable. At the end of the day, here's what it boiled down to. The President of the United States had a phone call with the then newly elected Ukrainian President, President Zelensky. During that phone call, the President of the United States asked the President of Ukraine to investigate Burisma, the corrupt Ukrainian energy company. This was not unique or new to the Trump administration. In fact, this had been US policy for years, including under the Obama administration. So President Trump asking President Zelensky to do that was not criminal. It certainly was not impeachable. It was not even wrong. That's why I voted the way I did, and I will defend that to my dying day. Then there are some things that we'll be able to turn back to now, which we have needed to address for some time. One of my next major pushes will be asking for reform of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA. FISA is a law that, while enacted with the best of intentions, well, it just got really romantic. Mood lighting. Oh, there we go. Now I came back. The folks at NSA did not like my message about FISA. That's why whenever I talk about FISA in critical tones, I'll stop and think for a minute. I better send something just for the FISA folks who may be listening. I just love this country. Maybe that will cause them to back up. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act has been used and abused for a number of nefarious purposes. We have to remember that this isn't new. What we do know is that new technologies are always manipulated by people who control the levers of government in order to engage in nefarious political maneuvers. For those of you who are old enough to remember the Church Commission, Frank Church, what was a senator from Idaho back in the 70s, put together a committee to investigate abuses of wiretaps and things like that. One of the conclusions that he reached was something that I read a few years ago and that I found chilling. He found that in every presidential administration, going all the way back to, I think, Wilson, at least as far back as FDR, up until Nixon, who was the president just before he conducted this investigation, had used our nation's intelligence gathering agencies for nefarious political purposes, for partisan political maneuvering, which is wrong. It's one of the reasons why we adopted a series of laws during that era to curb against those abuses. We've now got technology that makes it even more easy for the government to eavesdrop on the American people, and to do so under the backdoor auspices of foreign intelligence surveillance gathering. Now, when you do this, you've got to have protections in place to make sure that the government can't go back in and search its massive databases. Those databases, keep in mind, collect all kinds of information. Typically, they don't access that information unless that information connects in some way to a foreign intelligence gathering exercise of some sort or another. But we need additional protections in there because, as we've seen in recent years, those things are used by the government for bad purposes. It's not that you have to have a tinfoil hat to think this, because you don't. It's that you live in a world where you know people are fallible, they're flawed. Our government is not something that's invested with supernatural powers. It's neither omniscient nor omnipotent. It's neither benevolent nor malevolent. Governments consist of people. People who are authorized to use the overpowering force that is government In this case, the most physically powerful government the world has ever known. And unless you have important protections and controls in place, you know that those things will be abused. This is a reminder that we should all think of from time to time, regardless of your political persuasion, whether you're on the left or on the right or somewhere in between or a libertarian or whatever. You have to remember what James Madison told us in Federalist 51. He said that if men were angels, they wouldn't need government. Why? Well, what he means there, I think, is if we were angels, we wouldn't be human. If we were human, we wouldn't covet, and we wouldn't have a desire to harm one another. If we were angels, we wouldn't hurt other people or take their stuff. That's basically what it means. If men were angels, they wouldn't need government. And if men had access to angels to run their government, they wouldn't need to have rules about who governs and how they govern. But because we're not angels, we need government. Because we don't have access to angels, we do need rules. And that's where this comes into play. This document, written in 1787, has been modified a total of 27 times over the roughly 2.5 centuries since then, contains the rule book. It talks about what the government can't do. It describes how government is supposed to operate. It makes sure that no one person or no one group of people can have too much power. And it splits up power along two axes, one vertical, the other horizontal. The vertical protection we call federalism. That's where we said most of the power is supposed to be exercised here. At City Hall, see your awesome mayor here, at the state capitol. You've got outstanding representation here. Speaker Wilson and President Adams represent your community and our state really well. Most power is supposed to remain with them. There are only a few powers that are supposed to go to Washington. Then within Washington, we've got 3 different branches of the federal government. One branch, the one where I work, makes the laws. The branch headed by the president enforces the laws. The branch headed by the Supreme Court interprets them, where people disagree as to their meaning. Then on top of those structural protections, there are certain things the government just can't do. The government can't force you to speak or force you not to speak. It can't control what you print in your newspaper. The government can't tell you how to vote. The government can't tell you when, whether, where to go to church, who, how, when, or whether to worship. It can't compel you to give testimony against yourself. And it can't subject you to a warrantless, unreasonable search or seizure. That protection found in the Fourth Amendment is really important, and that's the protection that threatens to be trampled by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. I'm working on legislation that would significantly reform it by, among other things, expanding the number of circumstances in which we need an opposing counsel in the room when they're going in front of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to make sure that they're not running roughshod over your constitutional rights, and to make sure that they can't lightly go after you simply on the basis of your expression of your political or free speech ideas or your own religious ideas. These are some of the reforms that we need to get done and things that are very important. But with that, with those opening comments, I'd like to open up the floor to questions, and let's hear from you on whatever is concerning to you. I've got a microphone here. Who's got the microphone circulating? There we go. Just go ahead. You can select who asks the questions. Just make sure we get a wide distribution. When you ask the question, just tell me your name and where you're from.
Thank you very much. My name is Rick Chase, and we have a home in Tennessee, and we also have a home here in Salt Lake City. So I prepared a question on the basis of priority. It's an undisputed fact that all 50 states have been targeted by Russian interference in our elections.
Yeah, Russians didn't like that one either.
Russian interference. So to repeat, it's an undisputed fact that all 50 states were targeted by Russian interference into our elections. So it is rather concerning that the Republican Party would block documented all 5 recent attempts to secure our elections. Unfortunately, our senator in Tennessee, Marsha Blackburn, has been very vocal and very steadfast in blocking every legislative attempt to secure our elections. My question is, how would you justify, given that knowledge of Russia's interference, how would you justify your party blocking any attempt to secure elections? And secondly, I hope that it's not overtly offensive, it's not intended to be. Our concern is, with that information, why and with whom did you meet in Russia in September of 2019 to discuss removing sanctions, given that knowledge?
Rick, thank you for your questions. With regard to the first one, the legislation that Senator Blackburn has objected to is not fairly characterized as something that involves either Senator Blackburn or any other senator, Republican or Democrat, who disagrees with that legislation. Those are not the same thing as what you say they are. Objecting to that legislation doesn't mean that we want to block access to information about what Russia was trying to do or to block Russia from interfering in our election. There's not one senator, Republican or Democrat or independent, who is even remotely comfortable with that and who would allow that to happen. The legislation Senator Blackburn has objected to, and that I think every Republican senator, and perhaps some Democrats, I'm not sure, object to, is legislation that would further the path of federalizing elections. Our elections, while they are carried out, while they involve performance of the election, while they involve electing people to federal office at the same time we elect people to state and local office, they're conducted by local officials at the local level. The legislation that I understand Senator Blackburn to be objecting to is legislation that would massively increase the role of the federal government in the conduct of elections. That's dangerous. If you do that, to whatever degree that you do that, you're opening us up and making us that much more vulnerable to outside manipulation, either by the Russians or by others. And that's unwise. It's also bad from a question of federalism. But we know that the Russians have, for years, for decades in fact, attempted to have an influence on our election. So what happened this last time around wasn't new. One of the things that was new was that their level of sophistication has gotten more pronounced. That they were able to message a lot more effectively with the resources they've got through social media and otherwise. There's no evidence at this point that they changed the outcome of the election, but it's kind of scary what they were able to do. It's also very scary
I'm sorry, 34 people were charged with something in connection to election tampering. 34 people and 3 companies by our judicial system that you trust. That is evidence, Senator. Like, you can't say that there's not evidence for election tampering when 34 people and 3 companies. No, he's lying.
Charges and convictions are different things.
I want to be very clear on what I said. What I said was that there is no evidence that it changed the outcome of the election. That's very different from saying that election tampering didn't occur. I never said that, and I don't appreciate your mischaracterization of what I just said. As to my meeting in Russia, yeah, I went over there with my friend, Ambassador Huntsman, was over there as ambassador. I met with a number of lawmakers, including members of both chambers of their legislative branch, talking about religious freedom. And I don't know where you're getting the idea that I went over there to tell them that we were going to undo sanctions. I never saw.
Lake Tribune showed you the date.
Yeah. I told them that if they want better relations with the United States, they should do a better job at looking out for the interests of minorities, including religious persons, LGBT persons, and other traditionally afflicted minorities.
Hi, thank you for allowing me to speak. My name is Weldon Gilcrease. I'm a local physician and a local citizen, and I have something that's similar. I think one of the things that struck me when you were first speaking was this solemn oath, this idea of a solemn obligation. And as a physician, when I started medical school, I took something similar. So I'm here actually to talk about China. I work for an organization called Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, and most people in the room have probably never heard of forced organ harvesting. So it's a lot of what you're talking about. It's taking somebody because of what they believe or what ethnicity they are, and this goes actually to what you were speaking about with FISA in Western China and Xinjiang. So there's a group that's been targeted in a recent tribunal that published their findings in June of 2019, so just 8 months ago. And I'd like to just read a couple sentences. The tribunal notes that forced organ harvesting is of unmatched wickedness, even compared on a death-for-death basis with the killings by mass crime committed in the last century. There's justifiable belief in the minds of many, rising to probability or high probability that genocide has been committed against the Falun Gong. So what I'm asking, there is a Senate Resolution 220, and I'm asking for your thoughts on China because what I've seen in my work for my organization, what I've seen in my own institution, I work for one of the largest institutions and medical systems in the state and in the country, and what I've seen is highly problematic collusion and complicity with the Chinese Communist Party and their killing of this group, and I thank you for your time.
Thanks. Yeah, look, there's no question. The Chinese government is not very nice to Chinese citizens. I've been to Western China, went there a few years ago. When we visited a room sheet, there was a sort of a brooding omnipresence of the government there. You could tell that this was not a place where free expression and where religious freedom was fostered or respected. Anyway, I'm not familiar with this resolution, but I'll look at it.
I'm Janice Legler, and I would like to ask you a question about the recent and not so recent movements to get rid of the electoral college. I think there was another state that passed a law that they were not going to use the electoral college, they were going to use the popular vote. And my question is, are you against this or for this? And secondly, is it constitutional for these states to do this?
Thank you, Janice. I'm against it, and it certainly runs contrary to the spirit, if not the letter of the Constitution. Yeah, she's asking how I feel about the Electoral College. There are some states that have indicated they are against the Electoral College and they'd like to either get rid of it or circumvent it. Yes, there's an organization that's trying to push the national popular vote and deferring to the national popular vote in order to basically undo the Electoral College. I'm strongly against this movement. I'm strongly against it because I swore an oath to uphold, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. This is one of the moments when it's important to remember that we are a republic, not a pure democracy. One of the distinctions between a republic and a democracy is that in a republic you limit carefully the power of government, and you have institutions that intermediate between the people and the government. And one of the ways that our republic works is that it's at once democratic and in some cases counter-majoritarian. Sometimes counter-majoritarian impulses will lead government to do things that it shouldn't do, things like spying on its own people. That's not good. One of the ways that we make sure that these intermediating institutions protect us from the democratic whims of the day or the sort of mob rule mentality that could otherwise prevail is through things like the United States Senate, where every state is represented equally, regardless of the state's population. In fact, under Article 6 of the Constitution, that's one type of constitutional amendment that is itself preemptively unconstitutional. You can't amend that part of the Constitution that provides for equal representation in the Senate. The Electoral College is another example of this sort of thing, where we elect our presidents based on this system that amounts to basically a hybrid between each state's political power in presidential elections being decided according to population and according to their states. Each state gets represented in the Electoral College as the number of total votes they have, Senate plus House. So that's why we have it. It has served us well. Those who don't like it say, well, it runs contrary to democracy. Well, our Constitution is about a lot more than just deciding whatever simple majority of Americans might decide at any given moment. It's there to protect us from what happens with a runaway government. And this is an example of somebody who wants to give government more power and to take power away from intermediating institutions like the Electoral College. As to the wisdom or lack thereof of this proposal, I think it's terrible. Especially because they're playing into one of the strengths of our system, which is that, in theory, each member of the Electoral College has discretion as to who will receive their vote in the Electoral College. And what they're saying is, okay, let's just agree in advance. We're going to defer to whatever the national popular vote says, instead of deferring, as has traditionally occurred, to the will of the state in question. So it seems to me to undermine at least the spirit of the Constitution, if not also the letter, but in a way that probably isn't judicially enforceable. So anyway, I have grave concerns about that. I don't know what can be done to stop it. I don't think the courts can stop it, because this is probably outside the courts would likely deem this to be what's called a non-justiciable political question, meaning the individual electors who are elected to the Electoral College to make those decisions do technically have discretion. If they choose to exercise their discretion in that way, that might not be something that a court can remedy. We have to do that as a people.
Rick Strife, I live here in Farmington, 37-year military veteran. First, I want to just thank you for the great job you're doing and tell you that how utterly disappointed I was in your partner in the Senate from Utah. In regards to your war powers vote, I'm just wondering, with polarization that there is in the Congress nowadays, that how you ever come to a consensus of when the war powers, you know, without having a Pearl Harbor, how are you ever going to come to that consensus before it's too late? Thank you.
Great question, Rick. Thank you for asking that. The short answer is, that's the whole point. Most of the time we won't. And if we don't come to consensus, it's time to put the lives of our brave soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines on the line, unless there is the kind of consensus that can result in an act of Congress moving forward and declaring war. We have no business fighting a war. Not just constitutionally, but morally and ethically. We've had too much American blood spilled, and too much blood throughout the world spilled through unconstitutional, undeclared wars. And I will never support this. The question you raise is a fair one. I want to address the particulars of what you're describing here. Yes, it's true that from time to time something happens, an attack on the United States or on U.S. citizens, or especially U.S. Military personnel will occur. And in those circumstances, it becomes necessary at times for us to defend ourselves in an immediate defensive action. That has, since the time of George Washington, going back to the attacks by the Wabash and Miami Indians between 1791 and 1794, George Washington explained that he had the power to repel individual attacks and defend us against that without going to Congress. It's not until you deal with an ongoing offensive operation that you need to get an authorization for the use of military force or a declaration of war. And that's where I think we need to focus here. So this vote, yeah, I was the lead Republican sponsor of a War Powers Act resolution saying that without regard to what has happened so far, I mean, look, General Soleimani is gone. I think we're safer as a result of it. President Trump had authority to take out General Soleimani, and I've said this. the War Powers Act resolution we voted on last week had far more to do with what comes next than it did anything else. So here's what it says. What we passed last week says the 2001 authorization for the use of military force authorizing military action in Afghanistan does not authorize war against Iran. Number two, so neither the L1 AUMF dealing with Afghanistan or the O2 AUMF dealing with Iraq authorizes war with Iran. So that if we're going to go to war with Iran, we need to declare war on Iran or have an AUMF with respect to Iran. They're basically the same thing, an AUMF or a declaration of war. But we can't just assume that that exists. Under the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs, we've now been at war for nearly 2 decades. My daughter Eliza was a baby, a small, brand new baby, when the 9/11 attacks happened. She's in college now. We've been at war with Iraq and Afghanistan basically her entire lifetime. During that time, the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs authorizing war actions in Afghanistan and Iraq have been used to justify military strikes all over the place, including not only Iraq and Afghanistan, but Syria, Yemen, Libya, Mali, I mean, all kinds of places. That's wrong. So we have had a Congress that over the last few decades has allowed the legislative muscle to atrophy. It is our job to declare war. It is not morally or constitutionally defensible to go to war without a declaration of war. And if that means we go to fewer wars, that's fine by me.
Hi, Senator Lee. Thank you for your time. I'm Mark from Utah County, so I hope you don't mind that I have kind of snuck up here. But my question is actually related to the first question that was asked by the gentleman earlier. I have 4 young children, and I try and teach them the importance of being engaged in democracy and sort of being a part of that process. And so, while I am concerned about congressional, the lack of congressional action on election security bills, one of my greater concerns is the executive branch right now and their actions to invite foreign interference. We've known since 2016 that our elections are not secure. But what we didn't have in 2016 was a president who actively and repeatedly invited foreign interference in the election, both publicly and privately. We also didn't have a president who was willing to use the levers of his office, including close to $400 million of congressionally appropriated military aid in order to coerce an ally into corrupting our electoral process. So aside from the question of what will Congress do, I'm concerned as to what we'll do about an executive that is bent on inviting foreign interference into our elections. How am I supposed to sit down with my kids, who I teach the importance of of democratic engagement, and tell them that they should have any faith in the outcome of an election, when the person who's tasked with trying to protect the laws and the democracy of this country is actively inviting people to tamper with our elections?
All right. Basically asked 2 questions. One deals with separation of powers in the executive branch versus the legislative branch. The other one deals specifically with accusations that you've made against President Trump. Let me address each of those in turn. We'll start with the separation of powers issue. Look, you're right about the fact that we've got too much power that has been relinquished by the legislative branch over to the other political branch, meaning to the executive. This is an equal opportunity problem, meaning both political parties have contributed to it equally. Under the leadership of Houses of Representatives, of Senates, and of White Houses of every conceivable partisan combination, you've seen over the last 80 years a move to do a couple things. First, to take more power from the states and localities and move them to Washington. And then in a second step, you've seen an effort to take legislative powers away from the Congress itself, by Congress, and send it over to the executive branch. It's not supposed to be easy to start a war. It now is. It's not supposed to be easy to start a trade war, to start a series of retaliatory tariffs. It now is. It's not supposed to be easy to change the law, federal law, without both houses of Congress. In fact, it's not supposed to be possible at all. The very first clause of the first section of the first article of the Constitution says that all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Article 1, Section 7 goes on to explain that in order to make a federal law, you have to have the same policy proposal passed by the House of Representatives and passed by the Senate, and then signed into law by the President unless it's vetoed, in which case 2/3 of both houses can override that. But in any event, you got to follow that formula in order to make federal law. Over the last 8 years, both political parties have pushed this power over to the executive branch, to the point now where the executive branch, acting alone, can start a trade war, or start a regular war, because they've made it easy, because Congress pushes back against its own duty to declare war. We have given immense regulatory power over to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats, ostensibly under the president's umbrella of leadership, but in reality, many of these executive branch agencies operate outside the president's supervisory authority and are a de facto fourth branch of government that doesn't really work for you, and that imposes $2 trillion of regulatory compliance costs on the American economy each year, most of which ends up being carried by you. Not by big, wealthy corporate fat cats, but by hardworking, poor middle-class Americans who pay higher prices for everything they buy and also pay for it with diminished wages, unemployment, and underemployment. Yeah, this is a huge problem. And I've fought every day of my time in the United States Senate to deconsolidate that power. The President of the United States is intended to have sufficient power to do what a president does, but was never intended to have as much power as we've given him. That is not Donald Trump's fault. This is a fault 80 years in the making. And it is a problem that has been voluntarily created by Congress. With respect to your accusation, your conclusory accusation to the effect that we can no longer trust our elections and it's Donald Trump's fault, I just completely disagree with that. Look, yes, Congress appropriated $391 million. And with all due respect, Mark, if you want your kids to respect the elections, don't go around telling them they can't trust the elections. Don't do that. That's not right. It's not accurate. $391 million were in fact authorized by Congress to go to Ukraine. Now, let's stop and think about that for a minute. It's an enormous amount of money. Why the heck are we sending that much money to Ukraine anyway? But nonetheless, Congress passed law deciding that we would send $391 million to Ukraine last year. I voted against that because I don't think that's our business. I don't think it's our business to take money from you and send it to Ukraine. We act surprised when there are people in Ukraine lining up to try to influence American politics. And people lining up all over the world in places where we send enormous amount of money. And they're trying to interfere with U.S. politics. And we ask why. How can we be so foolish? Now, President Trump comes into office and he does ask some questions. Why? I wish he had vetoed that legislation. I really do. I voted against it. And he should have vetoed it. He didn't. But because he has concerns about the fact that we spend as many of your taxpayer dollars as we do outside of the United States for things that have, at best, a distant and attenuated link to your safety and well-being in the United States, he at least wanted to make sure that we could trust the new regime in Ukraine. And so he called President Zelensky shortly after he was elected. And he talked to him about what he thought he needed to talk about to figure out whether he had a trustworthy partner in him. So yeah, he did talk about things that he himself was familiar with. If you haven't been to Ukraine, as he may or may not have been, I don't know, you're going to start by talking about things that you know something about, and that's what he did. But I'm sorry, Mark, I'd encourage you to not tell your kids that they can't trust U.S. elections because President Trump asked Ukraine to do what Obama had been telling Ukraine to do for years, which is investigate Burisma.
Good morning, Senator Lee. First, I'd like to begin by thanking you for your time and also for being a senator who constantly relies on the Constitution and is based on principles and the decisions that he makes in Congress. So my question to you is, after the investigation or after the impeachment of Trump, there's still lots of smoke and unanswered questions in Ukraine. Do you think that investigations should still be pursued into Burisma and the Bidens and other things like that?
Well, I think they will be. And thank you for your question. I think they will be, and I think the impeachment process made sure of that. I was surprised when the House impeachment managers, the prosecutors appointed by the Speaker of the House of Representatives, who are themselves 7 members of the House of Representatives from different places across the country. I was surprised when they spent as much time as they did talking about the Bidens. I was surprised when they spent as much time as they did trying to say it is absolutely absurd to suggest that anyone would even consider that relevant. Joe Biden's role as the U.S. Facilitator of U.S. efforts to secure the fight against corruption in Ukraine somehow looked odd at the time when his son was being paid $1 million a year or so to do a job that no one has been able to tell us involved actual work. When we've asked the question, what we've gotten so far is he went to a board meeting once, and then he went to another board meeting, I think in Monaco, or what expertise he had. Now look, I wasn't as fired up about this until I heard Adam Schiff and Jerry Nadler and others among the House prosecution team go on at great length about how it was absolutely categorically false, that there could be no reason for anybody to even ask these questions. By doing that, I think they pretty well guaranteed that there are going to be some congressional investigations into what happened there. I hope they're happening.
Hi, Mr. Lee, thank you for being here today. My name is Shania Anderson. I've lived here in Davis County the majority of my life. I'm LDS, mother of 2, and college educated. My question regards, I'm going to start off with a tweet, actually, the President wrote out on the 14th of February. He quotes, "The President has never asked me to do anything in a criminal case." It's from A.G. Barr. "This doesn't mean that I do not have, as President, the legal right to do so. I do. But I have so far chosen not to. Tell me, do you agree that the President has the right to interfere with the Justice Department's criminal cases, especially ones regarding his own former or current associates? And what are you going to do to make sure that our Justice Department stays independent and unmoved by political sway?"
I suppose I could kick off my own town hall meeting circuit where I engaged in hypothetical speculation about what the President might mean by his tweets. I appreciate you reading that to me. I hadn't seen that tweet. I'm not sure what he meant by it. That's not something he ought to do. That's something I'll watch. I would strongly advise him, against saying things like that. I'm not sure what he meant, so I'm not going to comment further on that. I can't hear you. Okay. He might be referring to the fact that the Attorney General, along with every U.S. attorney, at any given moment, is someone who is appointed by the President and serves at the pleasure of the President. So, literally speaking, as a matter of law, he's right in that he can remove anyone he doesn't want in there at the time. Presidents have historically respected that and not removed people for light or transient reasons. I would hope and expect that he would do the same.
Hi, Helen Watts. I live here in Davis County in Layton. First of all, so grateful for you being where you are and representing us the way you do. As a constitutionalist, you understand the ways we elect people on the national level. Congress is elected by the people of the states and is responsible to the people and gets elected and re-elected every 2 years. The President should be elected by the Electoral College and is responsible to the states through the Electoral College. Senators originally were responsible to the states through the state legislatures and were installed and recalled through the legislatures and had the 6-year terms. The 17th Amendment removed that right from the states. I would like to know your position as a citizen on the 17th Amendment, and as a senator, would you support a recall of the 17th
Howard, there's no question that in 1913, when we ratified the 17th Amendment, things changed. We lost a feature of the Constitution that had previously been in place. The states were represented as states. The state governments, through their state legislatures, had the opportunity to select who would represent them every 6 years for each seat in the Senate. There's no question that that changed and that you can pinpoint back to that date, a moment when we started departing more from federalism, where the states were less well defended in terms of their sovereign authority. It didn't take too long. You know, it takes a little while once they get through the pipeline for that to have its full effect. But you know, prior to the New Deal era, in peacetime, the combined expenditures of the states always exceeded the outlays of the federal government. Since the Great Depression and the FDR presidency, it has always been the opposite, where even in peacetime, the combined outlays of the federal government exceed those of the states. That is another symptom of that. I don't know that, I don't think that this is something that can or will ever be corrected. I regard this as water under the bridge. Once you've given that power to the people, to the voters themselves to decide, politically and mechanically, I don't think it ever works to put it back. So even though I look at the year 1913 with a certain degree of sorrow, not only because it gave us the 17th Amendment and the changes I just described, it also gave us the 16th Amendment, which was also problematic, and the Federal Reserve. And it's the year we got Woodrow Wilson as president. It was a really bad quadrifecta. But that was water under the bridge.
Would you do term limits with that?
Yeah. I do support constitutional term limits. I believe the Constitution should be amended, and I've co-sponsored legislation proposing constitutional term limits.
Thank you for being here, Senator Lee. Edward Glade, I live in West Point. I'm a retired disabled veteran with 29 years service. And after I retired, I was evaluated by the VA and determined to be 40% disabled. And so they determined that I should receive a disability pay. In conjunction with that, they deducted that amount from my retired pay. So I do not get disability. And there's thousands of us in the same situation. 17 years ago, Congress got together and said, that's not right. We'll fix it for everybody that's over 50% disabled. And then we'll work on the others later. Well, I'm only 40% disabled, and after they fix it for the ones most disabled, they never did anything else. So I encourage you to introduce legislation to remember the rest of us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clay, for your service. I appreciate it deeply, and yeah, I'll look into that. So you're saying you're 40% disabled, so you have the same problem that was there before Congress fixed it, but with respect to 40%. Okay, I'll look into that.
$150,000 since I retired.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, Senator. My name is Luann Hudson. I live in Centerville. And I had a kumbaya moment with you recently when you walked out of a briefing and said, that's the lamest briefing I've been in my life. That's how I feel as a citizen. I feel like I'm being asked to disregard what I see happening in Washington. My concern today is the corrupting power of money. And can you tell me what you have done to help prevent the corrupting power of money? For example, I as a teacher, if I am promised money by a textbook publisher to purchase their books, that's a conflict of interest. I have to sign a form that says I don't participate in a conflict of interest, or if I do, I disclose it. Can you give us an example of situations where you've been had the corrupting influence of money and you've done the opposite?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Lance. So, first of all, a few years ago, there was something called the Stock Act that we passed through Congress. Voted for that. We wanted to make sure that members of Congress didn't have the opportunity to be corrupted, even through things like the acquisition of securities in a publicly traded corporation based on knowledge that they were obtaining and imposing very strict requirements on. It is, one can serve in Congress, I suppose, and break the law, but we've made it really, really hard. I mean, you've got to go way out of your way to decide you want to be corrupted. There is a sort of the capital C corruption that the law recognizes as corrupt. I think we also have to deal with the root causes of corruption, which in Washington are made significant, even in a lowercase c corruption sense. The corrupting influence of big government is a big thing, even where it doesn't culminate in someone breaking the law. Let me explain what I mean. When you vote for something that results in money going to your state or to your district, or even to somebody else's state or somebody else's district, you tend to get praised for that. When you vote against it, you tend to get criticized. And I know this from experience because I vote against a lot of stuff, especially spending bills. The very best thing that we can do to control corruption in Washington is to reduce the size, the scope, the power, and the funding going to Washington. We can't continue to send between 20 and 25 cents of every dollar that moves through the American economy to Washington, D.C., and expect that it's not going to create some problems. We can't continue to spend $4 trillion a year or so, $1 trillion a year more, by the way, than we're taking in tax revenue, and expect that the crumbs that fall from that table aren't going to be so huge that they have a huge corrupting influence. That's why federalism matters. That's why we need to return as much of the federal government back to you as possible. That's why we need to get the federal government back down to what it was supposed to be about, which is the powers identified in Article 1, Section 8. National defense, weights and measures, trademarks, copyrights and patents, postal roads, bankruptcy laws, regulating trade between the states and with foreign nations, and granting letters of marque and reprisal. There are a few others, but that's about it. That's what we should be focused on.
I live in Farmington, and my question, I think, relates to just what you talked about. I believe that when you first ran for Senate, you talked about balanced budget amendment, needing to control federal spending. We now have increased the debt unbelievably. I don't see how we're ever going to get out of this. How are we going to reduce the debt? There doesn't seem to be any interest in Congress about controlling spending and getting us out of the horrible hole we've dug ourselves into.
You're exactly right, and I'm so glad you asked that very question. And yes, I've been outspoken about that. I'm the author of the best, I'd like to say also the leading, but certainly the best balanced budget amendment proposal out there, one that would require Congress to pass by a supermajority legislation that spends more than we take in, and that would also limit us to a defined percentage of GDP so that we don't have these massive fluctuations in spending as compared to revenue. But it's very disconcerting that both political parties now seem to have abandoned this mantra. You now have Republicans, including many who campaigned as Republicans for the House or the Senate, who are voting to sustain spending practices that involve us spending $1 trillion a year more than we have money coming in. Now, it is not as though we're in a recession or a depression. We are at the top of the economic cycle. We're at the top of the peak. We've never had more money coming into the federal government, and yet we insist on spending $1 trillion a year more than we have coming in. This ties back to the answer I gave to a previous question, which is about why it is that members of Congress who run on fighting against that will then vote for a spending bill Let me explain to you a little bit about how this often works. And I'd like to invite anyone within the sound of my voice who shares my concern over this to help educate your friends and your neighbors and those representing you in Congress about your views on this. Here's how the spending bills often work. For years, so Republicans got the majority in the Senate following the 2014 election. Republicans had campaigned for a long time about wanting to spend less and have more control over it. For the next 2 years, those were the last 2 years of the Obama administration, we were told by our legislative leaders, well, we can't get everything we want because we still have a Democratic president. I thought that was nonsense because I believed it to be an excuse, and I voted against their excessive spending. Notwithstanding that, I did so, however, with a certain degree of patience, with the fact that I knew that we would eventually get a Republican president, and I was assured by legislative leaders in Congress and my own party that we would then undertake an effort to spend more cautiously. We didn't. We went in the opposite direction. The first full opportunity that we had to address one of these spending bills after President Trump took office, and I can explain the reasons why I would bore you to tears, but the first time we had a bill really teed up that could have done that was in, I believe, March or April of 2018. And I had been asking our legislative leaders for months, when are we going to get to see the spending bill? Will we be able to vote on it, debate it, discuss it, amend it, to make it better, to make sure that it doesn't spend too much? And I was told, yes, you'll be able to see it, you'll be able to amend it, you'll be able to make it better. Fast forward to one afternoon that spring, one evening that spring, 8:37 p.m., I received an email. That email said, attached is a copy of the spending bill that we'll be voting on. Didn't say when, it just said we'd be voting on it. And so it's 2,232 pages long in an attachment. Now, having been through this fire drill enough times, I knew this meant I needed to jump into action quickly. I immediately got my staff on the phone. We divided up the bill into segments. We assigned it out. We worked through the night, reading it, understanding what it did. And it was full of some really bad stuff. Pet projects for key legislative leaders who had identified, who had written this thing, in secret, by the way. I sometimes refer to it as the four-person law firm. McConnell, Schumer, Pelosi, McCarthy. They negotiated behind closed doors without any input from anybody. This part of it's not even partisan. This is just top-level leadership versus everybody else. Then they give it to us. So having been through this, we divided up, we started reading through, found all kinds of bad stuff in it. The House of Representatives passed that bill before lunch the next day. The Senate passed it in the middle of the night the next night. I voted against it. I was, I think, the only member of Utah's congressional delegation to vote against it. I would like more help in voting against those. It's not until we show them we're not going to vote for crap like that that we're ever going to get a hold of it. Make clear to those you represent federally that you don't want them to vote for those. If they can't even read it, let alone amend it to make sure that it doesn't spend too much, they shouldn't vote for it. By the way, I called the president right after that. The following morning, so we passed at 2 or 3 a.m. I wasn't going to call him at 2 or 3 a.m. That would be rude, but I waited until the next morning. I called the president asking him to veto it. He called me back, but by the time his staff gave him the message that I had called, he had already signed the bill. But he called me, and I was on the plane, and my secretary sent me a text message saying he's trying to reach you. And I said, well, I'm on the plane. And the Delta flight attendant started walking down the aisle, and they handed me a headset, and they said, the president is on the phone from the White House Situation Room. I'd like to talk to him. He told me that his staff had told him that it was impossible to veto it, that it was impossible to reconvene Congress to pass anything else. This is an example of how that system works. Legislative leadership in Congress tells members of Congress they have to vote for it, they have no choice. And then they tell the president the same thing, and it's wrong.
So real quick before we move on to questions, I want to point out a couple of folks. So in the back we have Nate Jackson, Brooklyn, Tana. In the hall we have Justin and Jessica. There's a few of us that are on Senator Lee's staff. There's no way we're going to be able to get to every question, but I want to make sure that everybody here who has something that they want the senator to be aware of knows who they can come and talk to. So please come and talk to us at the end. With that, we have time for 2 more questions. So I've got one here and one here.
Senator Lee, thank you very much for representing us, and I'd like to say thank you for standing with the President on for right to life. I really appreciate it. When we did the impeachment, we know that the House is totally responsible for starting the impeachment, and the Senate was to listen to the trials, but the Senate part had to be a 2/3 majority vote. In the House, it seemed like it only had to be a majority rather than 2/3. Why is it that if the House had been 2/3, we wouldn't even have gone through the impeachment in the first place? Why is the House less than the Senate?
In the same way that criminal charges are easier to bring than they are to prove in court, it is a feature of the Constitution that impeachment articles are easier to raise than they are to prove and remove the president. This was a compromise the Founding Fathers reached in order to say, look, if there is an allegation, let's have it raised, and a simple majority ought them not to be able to raise it. But to remove them, we want a 2/3 supermajority. It is instructive, however, that the impeachment process is never going to work. It's never going to culminate in somebody being removed unless they actually get a solid bipartisan supermajority on top of it. And it didn't receive a single Republican vote in the House, not one. They knew that it was going to fail at the outset, and they did it anyway, and I think that was unfortunate. Thanks for your comments on the life issue. We had a hearing last week in which we talked about the fact that children who are born alive following a failed abortion attempt ought to be allowed to live and not be left to suffer and die, as is known to have happened in hundreds of instances. It was stunning to see that not every member of the Senate Judiciary Committee seemed to want to talk about that word here.
Hi, I'm Dawn Nunn, and I live in Fruit Heights, Utah, and I'd like to talk about disability. I'd really like you to get behind the Disability Integration Act, which would allow people with disabilities to stay in their homes instead of being forced into care facilities. And this would save the taxpayers billions of dollars every year. In-home care is much less expensive than being forced into a facility, which is tens of thousands of dollars a year. And I'd really like to see you get behind that bill and help support us and get some of your colleagues behind it. Disability is rarely noticed, which is why we came out in bright orange. I'd also like to see a bill get passed that would help parents with disabilities, children with disabilities, who are in financial strain because of the high prices of prescription drugs. And I know that there is bills sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk that I would like to see Senate review.
As to the first bill, so it sounds like you're talking about a measure that would take existing federal dollars and expand their usage eligibility so that they didn't have to be used at an institution.
It would be under Medicaid.
Existing Medicaid dollars allowing them to be used in the home.
In the home, which would be a lot less expensive than forcing them into care facilities.
Has there been a bill filed on this in the Senate?
There is.
Do you know who has it?
It is the Equality Act. I cannot remember his name right now.
Yeah, it wouldn't be the Equality Act. That doesn't deal with disability. The Disability Integration Act.
Integration Act.
Got it.
Sorry, I'm a little nervous.
Right. I'll take a look at that. I'm not sure which bill you're talking about that's sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk. I'll tell you what I support in terms of controlling drug pricing. One of the many ways in which this problem manifests itself is in competition, basically anti-competitive practices within the pharmaceutical industry. In some instances, a manufacturer of a branded drug whose patent is about to expire, meaning is about to become eligible for generic competition, refuses to hand over a sample to a would-be generic manufacturer in bad faith. If they do that in bad faith, they can get away with it long enough. They can't ever get their approval from the FDA in order to begin manufacturing. That keeps the price of the branded prescription drug artificially high, and people end up paying more for that. This is a measure that I've supported for years and will continue to push it. There are myriad instances in which we can identify failures in the marketplace that have been created by the government and by the licensing system. Whenever we can do that, we can bring down the price of prescription drugs. Okay. I want to thank everybody for coming today. On a perfectly good Tuesday morning, you could have had your choice of doing a lot of other things. Being at your job or having a good time. If it were later in the year, I could say you could be at Lagoon, but Lagoon's not open. It really is an honor to be here with you. I love Farmington. I don't think I've ever met anyone from Farmington who isn't really nice. And one of my favorite people from Farmington, his name's Jim Hansen. I miss him. He's a good man. I still remember when I was first thinking about running for the United States Senate. Jim Hansen agreed to meet with me several times and talk to me about his service in the Congress and how much the people of Utah mean to him. And so it's great to be in his community. We've talked about some tough things today, and some things that not all of us agree on. When we talk about things like this, it can be easy to get gloomy about it. It can be easy to get to a point where you think that all hope is lost. But it isn't. Think about the blessings that we have in this country. We've got the strongest economy, the strongest military the world has ever known. We've got civil liberties that themselves are protected. The fact that we're able to have this conversation in public today, we're able to speak openly and candidly and even critically of government officials and government policies with which we disagree and about which we disagree, without any fear of retaliation from our own government, is itself a miracle. The fact that we have a Constitution that's now been in place since it was drafted in 1787 and ratified roughly 2 years later is itself a miracle. Sometimes it's important for us to reflect on the fact that what they dreamed in 1787, we live. And what they lived, we dreamed. Let's not lose sight of that. Or lose sight of the fact that as Americans, I believe our best days may well remain yet ahead of us. We're great as a country and we're successful. We've been successful not because of who we are, but because of the choices that we make, because we've chosen freedom. I hope that we'll all continue to choose freedom every single day. And thank you for coming to visit.